lapel.
I will turn the mic on when you go on the screen.
Yeah, okay, perfect.
In your pocket or wherever. Yeah, perfect. There is a belt thing too.
Is there?
Yeah.
Maybe pop it on there.
There's a hook here. You wanna put it here?
Yeah, sure.
Move your hand. Okay, done. I have a backup mic too.
Okay.
Maybe 2 or 3 more minutes.
Whatever works.
Okay. Are
Definitely.
you comfortable?
Very.
Do you need water? You have water?
Water's up there. I think I'm good to go. I think I'm in order when we're ready.
Is that your family over there?
So there's my father, then Caroline is just in beside him's his boyfriend, her boyfriend, and then Julia in the middle, and then her boyfriend Henry.
Those two
Boys, I don't know where the boys are.
Those two girls look like they would be your daughters.
Do they?
They look a lot like you. Is that true?
They have a little bit, that's for sure. Don't know where the boys are, and my
Oh,
Hi.
one boy.
Hi, how are you?
Robert, how are you?
Okay.
How are things?
Okay.
Breathing?
A little busy, but
A little busy.
yeah. How are things with you?
Very well, very
Good,
well.
good.
Yeah,
Looking
no,
forward to the talk today.
thank
very
you.
much.
Thanks for including me.
The book looks great.
It's settled in, and it's the whole layout of it is to students from the DRIP program.
Oh,
Like
is that right?
the entire book. One, I have to meet them after because she's still she's just going into her thesis year. The one who's been with me for 2 years working on the layout. Like she's remarkable,
Yeah.
absolutely remarkable.
We have some talented people here.
Well, the show's like off the charts.
Oh, you saw the?
Yeah, I've got to come back.
I think it's great. I love that room with the ribbon.
So did
It's it's all, in fact, like a lot about this on just atmosphere.
Yeah.
Like the hallway looks like a lot of U of T style drawing.
Yeah. In the up the second.
Yeah. But the in that room, it's fantastic.
Right. Although I like those collages of old.
No, I love them.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong.
Oh.
But it's a
It's a whole other thing in those other rooms.
yeah. No, they just we were talking about that concept of Stimmung.
Yeah.
Like just that atmospheric.
Yes.
And it's there. Like
Yeah.
it's
I haven't heard that word in a long time.
I think it's.
I know
I
it.
didn't
but-
know
but
that word.
It was popular in theory discourse, I guess, in, I don't know, 90s.
Is that right?
Well, I think because Getty was doing the text and document publications, and they were translating a lot of late 19th century and early 20th century German psychological theory on aesthetic experience. So that's where I think
It's definitely in sort of the neuroscience architecture side. It's coming back. Did that monitor get put in place?
It's there.
Fantastic.
Tell me, do you want me to get going?
Just a couple minutes.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's event, part of U of T's 2024 alumni reunion. My name is Robert Levitt, and I'm the acting dean at the Daniels faculty. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us today, and I hope that you enjoy the reunion as a whole. So before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit today. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. As many of you may know, the name of the avenue on which our faculty sits, Spadina, comes from the Anishinaabe word Spadina and means a place on a hill. This site was also part of an important trail for several First Nations, and as an institution committed to promoting truth and reconciliation, we note this history and we wish to honor these connections as we move forward collectively. And now for our guest lecture. Today's featured speaker, Tye Farrow, is a distinguished alumnus himself, having acquired a Bachelor of Architecture degree at U of T in 1987. Subsequently, Tye became the first Canadian architect to earn a Master of Neuroscience applied to Architecture from the University of Venice, and has a Master of Architecture degree in Urban Design from Harvard University as well. Currently, Tye is a senior partner at Toronto-based Farrow Partners Incorporated, a full-service architecture and master planning firm known internationally for creating architecture that lifts the human spirit. In the course of gaining all of this experience, Tye has become a widely recognized expert in how the intentional shaping of our environment can support our physical and neurological well-being. Among his firm's major projects in this area is the SZMC Helmsley Cancer Center in Jerusalem, a top facility for cancer treatment. Realized in partnership with Rubenstein Ofer, the 7,500 square meter complex provides physical, psychological, social, and spiritual care services in addition to patient assessment and treatment. The project is also pictured on the cover of Tye's new book called Constructing Health: How the Built Environment Enhances Your Mind's Health. In today's lecture, Tye will be drawing on the book and on examples from it to explain to us how recent discoveries in cognitive psychology and neuroscience can help form health-giving, person-to-place relationships that are similar to health and meaningful person-to-person relationships. At the end of the lecture, we'll have time for a question and answer, and then Tye will also be glad to sign copies of the book, which, if you don't have one, are also available for purchase in the commons outside the main hall over here. So thank you for joining us, and I welcome Tye to the stage.
Thank you. Good morning. How are you today? What I would like to do is begin to explore the relationship between what we create and how it affects our mind's health. To explore is the idea of how we define health. Is health, healthcare, wellness, and well-being all of the same thing? And then what we need to begin to understand equally is what causes health. Is it our healthcare system? Is it the arena of health? What's our society play in that overall equation? And if we begin to understand that, then I think we can walk a little further into beginning to understand if the built environment can in fact actually cause health on the decisions, the way we decide to choose to create our environments. And what I believe firmly is we have to discover a new path forward. We need to find another way where clearly placemaking is tied firmly to the idea of a health-generating system in the way that we choose to build. And the clear piece of the puzzle is that the spaces are created as an accelerant for our biological, our physiological, and our psychological health and well-being, meaning that we need to begin to start thinking about not what architecture is, but firmly what architecture does, meaning that it has the ability to cause health. What if health was the basis of judging every building, every urban space, and every place that we begin to occupy? What happens if we would no longer tolerate spaces that cause disease, and I'm using that word very, very specifically, or boredom and chronic mental health issues as a result of it? How do buildings and spaces make us feel? And more importantly, how do they make us feel better? What is really important is there's no such thing as neutral space. There's no space that sits firmly in the middle. It either does two things. One, it's either an accelerant for our health and well-being, or it sucks the life out of us, like a lot of environments that we're very, very familiar with. The other thing is that we have a pathogenic view of our life and the environments of which we occupy, as opposed to a salutogenic view. Everybody understands the word pathogenic. It's in our vocabulary, it's well known. It's out of the Latin and the Greek words of patho, meaning disease, and genesis, the origin. But what about salutogenesis? How many of us know that word? A few. Out of the words of solace, meaning health, and again, Genesis, origins. But the question is, why isn't that word in our vocabulary? This idea of things that actually create and cause health, as opposed to stopping bad things from happening as a fundamental pillar of how we think. Part of the reason is that contemporary scientists have discovered 8,000 known causes of disease or symptoms of disease, but we've only discovered 80 causes of health. Why is that? Why is it? It's because we find what we look for, and clearly we're focused on maybe the wrong things. One of the stats that I discovered in researching the book, which I find amazing, is that we spend more time inside our built environments than most whales spend underwater. And we're worried about the marine life because we know the microplastics and the other things that we're putting into the water have significant impact on the health and well-being of all marine life, on their bodies, on their minds, their operating systems. And we're very focused on creating high-performance buildings, which is very important, clearly on the ecological side of things. Think of the mechanical, the electrical systems, and the envelopes that we put around the buildings. But what about the human performance? What about what the building does to stimulate learning and memory and creativity and empathy and social interaction as the way we choose what and how we build our environments? Beginning to connect the dots between placemaking, mind health, and human performance. Who is this fine-looking gentleman? Anybody know who that is? I'll give you a hint. He was responsible for creating this. Frederick Law Olmsted. What was Frederick Law Olmsted? The founder of, we have a landscape architect in the audience with us. He was known as we know him as the father of modern landscape architecture. But in fact, he wasn't a landscape architect. He was not a landscape architect. His two sons were. They started the program of landscape architecture at Harvard. But he was the founder of the United States Sanitary Commission, which in fact is the forerunner to the Red Cross. He wasn't a landscape architect. In fact, he was this extraordinary early public health leader. In the research, which was interesting also, is think about how many architects are here, landscape architects in the group. So, think of creating an extraordinary design. Think you've put all of your energy into this amazing building and you're going in to pitch it to your client. And how do you describe it? Do you walk in and say, you've done this amazing thing like Central Park, and you walk in and you say, what do you think of this great sanitary institution? Can you imagine pitching it that way? But in fact, what he did is he mixed and tied together and used design as a tool to enhance ecological, physical, societal, and mind health as a result of how he created the environments. This idea of linking together design that is health-giving, thinking of what we do not as architecture, landscape architecture, but in fact the act of design as public health. Clearly, we know design has a significant impact on ecological health, and clearly that's in the public realm as well as within our profession. Clearly, we know that the way we design has a significant impact on societal health. And in fact, arguably, we've been complicit in the way that we design and zone and create places to separate these people from those people as a result of what we've done as a profession. And clearly we know design has a significant impact on our physical health and the tsunami of chronic disease that's been washing across our country since the 40s. Environments like this we know as food deserts. But they're not food deserts, they're food swamps. They're full of things that have significant impact on our physiological and our psychological health. And it's only beginning to be realized now, this intersection and the impact of what we design specifically on mind health, and the intersection that's just emerging, maybe 20 years old, around neuroscience and architecture. Again, coming back to connect the dots between placemaking, mind health, and human performance. So let's walk and deepen our knowledge a little more into this idea of environmental enrichment. So environmental enrichment, it began in the 1940s by a Canadian, a scientist called Hebe. And what he did is he had lab mice in his lab, in the regular lab cages. But he decided to bring those mice home, and he put them in an environment such as this, called an enriched environment, which had things for them to run around. And what he discovered is, as a result of the environment, the mice lived longer, they had fewer social issues, they were better at solving problems than the ones that were in the lab cages. This research goes on further into the 1960s. For me, a very interesting lady called Diamond at the University of California, Berkeley. And what she did is took this research further, and she took mice and she put them in a regular lab cage that had, the water bottle and the running thing. She then put some in enriched environments similar to this. And she had some that were in the impoverished environments, like the lab cages with the bright lights. And after 30 days, just 30 days, she dissected the brains. 30 days of being in these environments. What does she discover? The mice that are in the enriched environments, the synapses, which are the connections between the neurons, very, very important, they grew at a rate of 25%. In 30 days, 1 month. What happened to the mice that were in the regular cages? Nothing changed in their brains. The ones in the impoverished environments, the synapse begin to wither like a plant does without water or sunlight. And the important thing, in the enriched environments, the cortex begins to grow also. This research goes on further where they're looking at addiction. They have lab mice in a little cage with a water bottle with morphine in it. And so what do the mice do? They keep going to the water bottle. But then what they do is they have a door that opens up through a tube into another space beside it. The mice discover it, go through the opening and in the tube into the enriched environment, and they don't go back. They don't go back to the drug because the environment is helping and stimulating them in the adjacent space. And so clearly this idea that the spaces we create change our physiology, our biology, and our psychology as a result of it, or in fact they can begin to damage it. And a very important case that happened, this is in California, a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court that showed that the environment damaged your body and specifically your brain. The case is around the Angola 3. 3 people in solitary confinement from 10 to 15 to just shy of 30 years. 30 years in solitary confinement in a room without a window, and you're only out of that room 1 hour a day. Remarkable. But the case was very important because it showed that damaged the hippocampus, which is at the bottom of the brain, very important for a variety of things, spatial navigation, memory, as a result of it. But the brain begins to wither like a plant because of the environment. And take that a step further. Right now, in countries today, they're grabbing either dissidents or reporters off the street, and they're bringing them into rooms like this that have white light on all times, white furniture, white walls, and just to be certain that they will destroy the person, they feed them, quite dastardly, white rice on white plates. It breaks them. It only takes 6 months, not a long time. But when they come out, they can't function. Maybe we should move on to something maybe a little more uplifting, do you think? Maybe we should shift gears a little bit. Let's get back into the positive side of environmental enrichment. Breathe, everybody, a bit. Okay. So the idea is that when you walked in the threshold, in through the building, you knew, your body was telling you what the experience was that you were going to have. Consciously, subconsciously, pre-consciously, your body was communicating. In fact, there's about 11 million bits of information that's coming into your body like a radar dish. Everything is coming in to telling you about what is happening. And interestingly, there's about only 50 of it subconscious. Your brain is housed in your skull. The operating system is the mind, and it is embodied. It goes through our entire body and collects this information. And it goes through a whole variety of different systems, including the nervous systems, that begin to communicate the idea, do you want to stay, do you want to linger, or do you want to move quickly out of that space, meaning that it has the physiological and the psychological transformations. Reduces your cortisol level, which is on the stress rate, your heart rate, your blood pressure, and in fact, as we've heard, it begins to enhance or has the ability to adjust your neurons and the synapses and neuroregeneration, which is a very important part of the puzzle. But this research has been going on for a long time. This stuff in the 1940s that begins to tie together the dots between behavior, which is really tied together between the environment and the person, both conscious and subconscious. It continues on into this. I'm not going to get into it. It's covered into the book. But there's deep research between the idea of space and human performance. Specifically, place attachment theory, for me, is very important because really what it is the idea that we form relationships with the places we're in. We form them in the same way that we form meaningful relationships, person to person, We do it in the same way as we form person-to-place relationships, and it's tied to this idea we'll get into in a minute, this idea of a sense of coherence. And in the book, there's a very robust bibliography, 50 books to read, as well as a glossary of terms to help us deepen our understanding a bit. But what I want to do is, if we know this information, if we have this information, what does it mean to us? This guy, Ray Pentecost, he runs the Center for Health Systems at Texas A&M, and he's written a review of the book in the very influential Health Environment Research and Design Journal. It's the United States journal. It goes globally. But he writes the review of the book, and what he asks is, if we understand that a building impacts the health of the people that use it, how and to what degree are we, as design professionals, accountable for that impact, either positive or negative? What's our role in it if we have the knowledge? In fact, from an ethical standpoint, is that important? So, to my mind, I believe we need to think of our environments as non-invasive therapeutic treatments. The act of building as a non-invasive therapeutic treatment that has the ability, again, to stimulate learning, memory, social interaction, empathy as a result of the decisions we begin to make. That idea that the spaces we go into, those 11 million bits of information that are coming to us, they feed us. And in fact, really the idea or the metaphor that in fact architecture is like food. We consume it. We consume it. It enriches our minds, our bodies, and in fact our spiritual health, or that idea of a sense of coherence. Or in fact, it does the exact opposite. Again, thinking of space as empty calories. Again, back to that idea of disease and boredom and depression. In fact, we realize this going through COVID. And in fact, why is everybody choosing to stay at home right now instead of going back to the office? Not sure if it's fair to show this just before lunch. But what is this? It is a metaphor of the buildings we create. Transactional, just like this hamburger. The buildings, what are we asked to do? They need to be functional. We hear that a lot, don't we? The building needs to be functional. Well, this is functional. You don't need a plate. You don't need a knife and a fork. You can hold it and you can consume it and eat it. It does its job. It's very functional. It gives you the calorie and the protein. But what it does is after an hour, like a lot of the buildings we occupy, it leaves you feeling empty. And in fact, the sodium content and the other additives that are in this thing, in fact, does more damage to your body. Back like our little mice that are in the impoverished environments. How many environments do we inhabit that are like this? Supercharged with minerals and vitamins, architectural supervitamins, that in fact do extraordinary things to our nervous system, immunity, our physical health, our mind health. And why is that relevant to the cities that we create, the places we go to learn, and in fact the spots that we go to heal, and in fact the places that we go to work? How many people have spent part of their career in an environment similar to this? I don't know if you read the fine print on the invite to this thing, but at the end of the lecture, you need to come up front because we have to dissect your brain to, in fact, to do a little bit of that study on the synapses. And everybody else who's feeling very smart of themselves because they've been in enriched environments all their life, you need to participate too, just to make sure you've got those 25% extra synapses. But let's deepen our knowledge a little further on this idea of perception and how does perception work. For me, there's a very interesting lady, Barrett, she's a Canadian. She has a lab in the States, and she's developed this idea, the constructed theory of emotion, which effectively begins to look at our external space and our internal space. And effectively what she says is that there's inputs that come in through our senses, like that body is a radar dish, and in fact then there are predictions. Do we want to stay? Do we want to spend time in this place or with a person? But importantly, those things are colored by things that we have learned, or in fact things that we've experienced. And so we can understand those as cultural or social, or things that we've remembered as a result of it. What's an example of that? What's a simple example of it? Think of a bumblebee. And so in the external world, do you see that bumblebee on one flower by itself when you're walking through, up a mountain, and that bumblebee is dancing from flower to flower? Or are you on a busy, hot summer street and there's a swarm that's coming in towards you? Clearly, there's a whole variety of things that are coming through our senses, which is it the sound of the single bee dancing away? Or is that swarm, that sound of the swarm that's coming towards you? Visually, is it dancing? Or is it bumping into you? Is it touching you? And in fact, then that goes into the idea of things we've remembered and things we've experienced or learned socially. Did you read this morning in the news that there's killer bees that are coming to Ontario? Were you watching a cartoon of bumblebees? Or in fact, that idea, are you deadly allergic to a bee sting? Or in fact, are you a beekeeper? All of that thing begins to determine, is this somewhere we want to stay, or is it something we want to move away from? And in fact, you can take the same lens to look at city streets. Is it a street that's cobblestones with cafes, a bench to sit on, shade, cafes that you hear the sound, or is it a busy street, with a narrow sidewalk and boarded up on the retail or other things? All of those things begin to communicate messages to you. And if we take that a step further into this idea of the place attachment theory, and we studied this with a psychologist and a sociology, back to this idea that we form relationships, the way we form meaningful person-to-place relationships is the same way that we form meaningful person-to-person relationships. Simply think of somebody who was a mentor, a fantastic mentor that was giving, that just helped you along in your career without being asked. Or in fact, you could imagine the opposite, the ones that are more abusive. But in fact, if you dig a bit deeper into it, which we did, this symbol is really of all our emotions, it's really simplified, and there's sort of the range of emotions going from left to right, from negative to sort of positive, and then the intensity going from the very bottom, sluggish and sleepy, all the way up to the top. That's very, very excited. We're focused on the positive side, not that the other side isn't important. But the way that we form these meaningful relationships are formed in a couple things. This idea of feeling emotionally safe, understood and accepted, and this other idea of being able to activate our own resources, which comes down to this idea of a sense of a sense of coherence, which is tied to the roots of comprehensibility, manageability, and meaningfulness. Meaning that if you don't have purpose, you don't get up out of bed in the morning. And this begins to translate itself further into exactly that idea. We read it in our mind's eye the same way, the person-to-place relationships as we form person-to-person, meaningful person-to-person relationships, which comes back to this idea, in short, is really a sense of coherence, that things seem to be organized and we'll be able to move through in a meaningful way. What I want to do is, this comes out of the research from the University of Venice, is just walk a little further and in a very brief summary, go into a lot more into the book, but this idea of qualities of enriched environments and what are they. And what I want to state is that these things, they're not prescriptive. The idea that they're more like ingredients that you add to your food. What do I mean by that? Think of cinnamon. Cinnamon has that sort of earthy, sometimes a little sweet sort of flavor to it. The context is the important part. Cinnamon remains the same, but if you think it in a Western culture, what do we associate with? Maybe Christmas, maybe a spiced wine, maybe a spiced goose using cinnamon. But in fact, if you go to India and you have an Indian biryani, Clearly the flavor is the same, but the context is different. And I think that's the same thing in these examples, because what's an architectural example? Well, think of, if we say, a pediment, a Georgian pediment, columns, for example. What does that communicate to us, for the most part? Order, good government, maybe a government building or something, maybe a courthouse. But that's in a context from a specific way that we're seeing it. Take that exact same thing and move it to the deep south in the United States or South Africa. What does it communicate? In fact, the exact opposite. It's about oppression as a result of the visual cue. So the important thing is these things are more like ingredients that begin to have a flavor, but they're different because of context and culture and past experience. So let's walk through them. Generosity, this idea of surroundings that give more. Picture that back to the mentor that began to help you. But it's not always about giving more. Maybe it's walking down the street and there's a bench or a tree that creates some shade. But it's not always about giving more. Look at two Pritzker Prize winning architects, the Chilean architect, I've lost his name. Remember, he did the half house, that half the house was built, the other part was enclosed. And so that over time, as your family grew, you could begin to add and change it along the way. And look at the two French Pritzker Prize winning architects from 2 years ago, the housing that they created. One of the key pieces was the choices that people could make in changing the space over time. And so there's an idea of generosity. And the other important thing is the idea of the generosity of the process. Meaning if you're going to get healthy designs, you need a healthy design process that is co-creative and has a wide variety of voices around it. Authenticity, clearly we understand that in the environments. Variety and vitality, this idea of spaces that begin to lead you through, that concept of seeking and curiosity, positive ambiguity, which we'll get into in a minute, and this idea of hope. Hope is very different than optimism. I could think in my mind's eye that I can play in the NBA, but that might be a little more optimistic as an idea. Hope, and it's tied into it's the Snyder theory of hope theory, and what he lays out is that you need to be able to lay out a path forward. You need to understand the barriers that come in front of you, and you have to figure out how you can get around those barriers. Nature, we hear a lot about biophilia. It's not just about natural plants, but it's about natural light, natural forms, natural materials. And another thing, this idea of mid-range fractal patterns, mid-range complexity of fractal patterns. We'll touch on that briefly in a minute. This last one about silence and stillness and solidity and intimacy. We can picture that as the person-to-person relationships. And in fact, we discovered a bit of that coming through COVID also, this idea of an unplugged architecture that we can begin to hear ourselves. So I'm going to march through these very, very quickly and just show you some examples. And a variety of these concepts are in a variety of these buildings. I just want to show you as examples. You can begin to judge if it makes sense or not, but they are just things to begin to explore. So this idea of generosity, and affordances and dignity. Affordances are those ideas of what things allow you to do. What's a good example of that? Think of walking up to a front door and the door, the handles. Do you push it? Do you pull it? You don't know. That's not generous through the affordance that it offers you. And dignity is clearly an important one that's tied into it. But this idea to communicate and give more than they're asked for. This is a school that we were involved with. Anybody went to a school like this? A parking lot or a building surrounded by a parking lot? Where is the front door? Does anybody know where the front door is or how to get into the building? Back to the idea of affordances. It doesn't communicate it. The building we've created, you can see the parking lot, then there's a garden, so you go from the parking lot through the garden. From the garden you come to a covered canopy, you come into the building then opens up to another courtyard that you can spill out to, and then the rest of the school beyond. So you can begin to understand the section, beginning to move through into the garden. And this idea that as you pass through, back to the variety and vitality, the sense of occurrence, that the paths aren't straight, your view is continually changing as you walk through the garden and the planting, the choice and the scent of the soil as well as the plant material, so it begins to communicate through your other senses. Walking into the building, the entrance is at the far corner. The building sits up slightly, and then it begins to open into the courtyard beyond, and then this sort of, the plan is curved specifically so that your vision begins to change. The patterns of the half circles, when you see them, one is a circle, then the geometry begins to change perceptually, and then we'll get into it in a second, this overlay of these sort of fractal patterns between and the density of them between the curves and the triangular shapes as part of it. But beginning to use this space simply with the change of light throughout the day or the seasons or the weather to help communicate simply that you're alive through all of your senses. This idea of variety and vitality, this idea of the sense of curiosity as an idea, and I'm just going to step back, the painting in the background, Jackson Pollock. Why do people lash millions and millions of dollars at Jackson Pollock paintings? Why are they so valuable? There's a guy, Richard Jackson, a professor in Seattle. He studied these fractal patterns and the complexity of fractal patterns. Very, very simple landscapes. They don't stimulate our mind's eye. If they're very complex, they're confusing and we don't want to spend time at them. There is a mid-range fractal pattern in landscapes, other things that we see that really stimulate the mind. And in fact, he studied that, but then he studied Jackson Pollock paintings. And what he discovered is the fractal complexity within the pattern, in fact, sits exactly in that sweet spot, which may tie together and link the dots between why they appear to be so valuable to us. But this idea of variety and vitality and the sense of occurrence, this is a school that we finished, and the outside of it is an exoskeletal structure. So think of a lobster, with the structure on the outside holding up the roof. This is the structure on the way it's organized. What you'll see in the structure is that there are a variety of shapes intentionally, tying back to this idea of consonance and distance in music. That slow rhythm that begins to happen, and then the sparks that jump out between the shapes that are created here. The question is why? Why did we do this? Is it just an architectural expression that's applied to the exterior of the building? The important thing is that what the structure does when you're within the building, what it begins to communicate, almost like being in a treehouse with the forms, but it's the idea that these shapes begin to then project the shadows that are continually changing on the inside of the environment, so that in fact it begins to stimulate, back to the idea of the variety and vitality. If we're trying to get the students to be creative and learning within the space, what is the architecture doing to begin to use it as a non-invasive therapeutic treatment through the act of building and creating? This idea of hope that we've talked about, the sense of coherence, this cancer center that we've just opened in Jerusalem, that like a lot of hospital buildings, they're solid. They sort of push their chest forward, and we were trying to create something that began to communicate a different message, as well as the way the architecture is designed, is it captures light and becomes very, very moody. The people that work there are calling it a butterfly, and think that it begins to represent that transformation from a bug to from a caterpillar to a butterfly, like the journey that you go on when you're on a cancer journey. But some of these public areas, which in fact is now a very important public space within it, but these very intimate areas that are just one level up for the families or the patients that are are coming for treatment, but just communicating very specific messages about what the journey is that you're on, this again, sort of an exoskeletal system that creates a brise-soleil for the building within, but within the building has a number of these terraces. They're not programmed. They're not a reception, they're not a waiting area. They're just a place to come and sit, either if you're working there, your family, or otherwise, all under daylight. And this bottom garden is very important because when you walk out from your radiation treatment, you may not be feeling your best and wondering what the future is. This is the view that you look at. The garden, the material in the garden, the soil has the scent of a forest. So it begins to communicate and bring you back somewhere else. The wood, it's the largest mass timber building in the region. You see that it begins to creep up the walls and begins to bend and grow up over top of the ceiling. These very gentle waves have a relationship to your breathing, the pattern of optimal breathing. These terraces that are just simply gathering spaces, just to come and sit, take a breath under the light and the changing light. The materiality, the scent of the wood also begins to communicate messages. In fact, specifically wood, it lowers your beta and theta waves, which is one is on the stress side and one is on the positive emotional side, because these things do things. They change our biology, our physiology, and our psychology as a result of the choices we make. We've talked about nature and the patterns, but again, it's not just natural plants, it's natural light, it's natural materials, and it's natural shapes that can be infused into the places and these fractal patterns that we've talked about also. And just this last one, this idea of silence and stillness, solidness and intimacy. We can think of that as the relationship that we have person to person. What does it begin to look like, that unplugged architecture? This is just a house in the city of Toronto, in our city, which is trying to be very, very moody, specifically around daylight. The inside, all of the surfaces of that bridge, the side of the bridge, in fact the walls, are back-painted glass. And you see a lot of the other buildings, we're using a lot of mass timber in them for very specific reasons. This house was to get something that was just reflective. It's a simple, Toronto house. We carved out the middle and really pulled out the side. But this idea that from the morning light that comes in, as it changes, if a storm goes over in front of the side and the light changes, the mood begins to change, as well as just moonlight. All of the surfaces begin to capture the light and communicate it back to us quite intentionally. And the forms are trying to do the same thing, to wrap us and embrace as a result of the choices we make. But I just want to finish from where we started. There is no such thing as neutral space. There's nothing that sits in the middle. What we choose to create has the ability and does change our biology, our psychology, and our physiology, either from the positive side of things, or in fact, a lot of the spaces we occupy are on the negative side. And what's our responsibility if we have that knowledge? This idea that we're exactly like this little plant. Look at it stretching to the window and the daylight. Reaching, because tying back to the idea that the spaces have the ability to stimulate memory, creativity, learning, empathy, social interaction. And in fact, they have the ability to feed us, like these little blueberries, remarkable little blueberries that are packed with minerals and vitamins that do extraordinary things to all aspects of our body. This idea of space as a non-invasive therapeutic treatment that feeds us. I believe we need to find a new path forward. We need to begin to connect the dots between placemaking as a health-generating system that changes us and can create the conditions of which we can deal with a lot of the challenges in front of us. This idea of architecture, not by what it is, but what it does. Why is this important? Why is this important? Because we have to create the conditions of which we can thrive and flourish to meet the challenges that we have, and there are many in front of us. If you have further interest, there's a book table outside. It's 80,000 words. There's about 450 images, so it's very accessible, good glossary of terms, 50 books to read to help deepen. The responses have been fantastic from the UK, from Finland, Italy, Sweden, Brazil, Canada, and in fact, Johns Hopkins University, and in fact, a scholar at the Salk Institute. But the idea of the book is to do one thing, is to disseminate information. Thank you.
That's great. Let me join us. This is working? Yeah. Oh, great. That was very nourishing. Thank you. And stimulating. That was great. Thank you so much for that talk. And we have some time for Q&A. I'm going to I'll start with a question, then we'll turn it over to the audience. One of the things I was thinking about, and your lecture sort of developed and evolved over the course, but you started out with extreme examples of stimulating environments versus very sensory deprivation environments, whether for the mice or the prisoners. But architecture rarely doesn't usually occupy that space. And I was thinking that in a way, and you moved into this in the course of your talk, that what is stimulating to us is very contingent upon cultural circumstances or conditionings and individual sensibilities. And I was thinking that in some ways, that for instance, your architecture has a lot of organic and curvilinear form or branching complexity in the sort of arboreal forms of some of the projects. And I think, in a way it stands in contrast to certain episodes of modern architecture. Like I kept thinking of Sarin and CBS building in New York, and always how it's part of, something that I always found personally exciting about it. When you touch the bottom of that straight up black rock, as it's called, you feel like you're touching the sky. Mm. So, but it's at the other end of the spectrum of serial, repetitive, in some respects, minimal. And I just wonder, I don't know, I guess, I think in the end, architects and people have there's such a vast range that represents the experiences that are stimulating and enriching. And I don't know, I don't know if you have any thoughts on, well, maybe maybe you have a very capacious view of the spectrum that might fit the goals that you're talking about. I just wonder if you have anything to say about all that.
Yeah, Heather Wick in the UK has got this book and this campaign that's out about boring buildings, and he's arguing that whole sectors of different types of buildings are boring. In fact, a lot of the modern, I think he is grouping into that. I haven't finished the book. I haven't, but I'm really worried about that, because I don't think I can tell you what a boring building is, because it comes back to my social my construct of experiences that I've had, like that pediment in Toronto or South Africa. And I think it's very dangerous to say things are boring, because I think if you look at different societies and what we need, what feeds us is we know a lot of buildings that are very still and quiet and very careful in what and how they're created, and they're nourishing, extremely nourishing, and some could call them boring. But I don't think you can do that. And then some buildings in context, that are over the top. But in culture, like if you look at dress, for example, in different cultures, on between things, on those two extremes and what's right and what's wrong, it becomes very dangerous. So what we've tried to do is this idea that it's not prescriptive. What we're trying to describe is how we build relationships, how I form a relationship with you that is meaningful and memorable and enriching, because of a variety of different things on how we communicate to one another. But that could be very different to how I form it with somebody else. But there's qualities and characteristics that are the important part. And so if we just, back to that lens of generosity or affordances or dignity as a concept, that can look very, very different in very different contexts and needs. But the important thing, or at least what we're trying to do, is we're trying to talk about it like ingredients. That these are things that we use, and we know when we cook, they can have massively different outcomes of what the experience is. But those flavors, like generosity, that may look very, very different, but we can sense it. And so I think that's I'm not here to push that, we should be doing things that are like this or otherwise. We're doing it to explore something specifically, but it's not a formula. It's, I think, a way of thinking, back to that idea, not what the architecture is, but what it does, and what it does to all of this.
I suppose it's also context sensitive in other ways. I mean, the CBS building is a quiet building in the midst of Manhattan, so it depends in that respect as well.
Yeah.
Anyway, I will turn to the audience and see if any of you have any questions for Tye or thoughts. We'll get a speaker to you so that. Sorry, could you?
There's a mic.
Is it my turn? Yeah. What other trends do you see happening in healthcare systems? I remember with the McMaster University Medical Center that they were putting the spaces in place like blocks, and there was a meditation room and this sort of thing. What are the trends now, as well as the colors? The whole place was color-coded.
In the healthcare zone of our practice, we're work in a variety of different areas. Healthcare is an interesting one. In fact, if I step back, the purpose of this book, one of the questions it poses is really, what would we need to do to eradicate hospitals as we currently know them? Effectively put ourselves out of a job. What do we need to do that? And there's a lot of stuff that's upstream. But I think there's a bigger discussion around that. What's amazing in the healthcare system right now is all the personalized, predictive, participatory care that we're going through. And in fact, there's also the whole other wellness side of it, the naturopathic side, the precision medicine that is really, really exciting. But the idea of the journey as this immersive experience that you're going through if you're on a healthcare journey. What do I mean by that, and what are examples of it? So this cancer center, we worked with an extraordinary neuroscientist that is deep into the idea of embreathment. What does embreathment mean? Effectively, the basis is that if you can visualize your breathing, you can begin to regulate your senses. And the important thing is that what he's discovered, and I think he's coined the term of embreathment, is that as it relates to architecture, is that we have top-down and bottom-up sensory perception on our mind. What that means is that if you're walking down the street and you see your foot stepping on a nail and the nail goes through the top of your boot, what happens? And this was in the British Medical Journal as an example. You see the nail going through the top of your boot, and instantly you're in excruciating pain, which in fact happened to this guy. So all of his guys take and lay this guy down, and they take off the boot, and what do they discover? Went straight between his toes. But this thing is telling me I should be in severe pain. But the other thing is what this guy's doing and what we did in the center is that all of our senses regulate pain, pleasure, claustrophobia. And so in the CT suites, you know, those things you go into that are like the big donut, about 30% of us have claustrophobia. And if you go into children, it's probably up to 45%. And so to get somebody to delay in this thing for a good medical outcome isn't a very good thing. So what we do is we have this screen that is tied back by specific artwork on your breathing rate. We have an aposonic sound system, which is 12 speakers in the room, and in fact haptics that are on the bottom that they touch you. And so this idea of a multi-sensorial, multi-immersive thing, this is in front of it has to go through the medical ethics board in the hospital, but in fact it's improving outcomes because people are more relaxed. So now what we're doing is we're in the early stages of, like these screens that you've showed, they're haptic. And in fact, they can pick up your heart rate or they can be tuned to the optimal heart rate. So this kinetic thing that begins to move, we're beginning to look at it in education spaces, sort of like these things that would begin to move like to your optimal heart rate in your breathing, almost like a breeze that we know, under trees, or that flow of water or a fire burning, they all tie into the same thing. So again, using all of these tools that are specifically architecture to help tune optimal human performance.
More questions? Yes, over here. But could you wait for the microphone? Here. Oh.
Start here and then move over.
1, 2. Sorry.
Sorry to steal your spot. Thank you for your presentation. So my question is, if you were to design a house today, just something simple, no mansion, nothing like that, just a basic, simple house that most of us could afford, what would be 2 or 3 of the most important practical features, in your opinion, that you would make sure to instill to optimize for our health? Well,
I think if we just step back just slightly from that, the difference between a house and a home. A house is more tied to sort of René Descartes and more of sort of a rational thought of that it is about what is it, we have a living room, do we have a dining room, what are the size of them, and they get it assembled into a collage of some sort. The home, on the other idea, it is the memories and the experiences that are evoked as a result of the space that we occupy. And that might be very different for me than you. You might want something, again, that's minimalist and modern and steel or something else. I might want to live in something, that's Victorian and has all of the wallpaper and the other stuff. I think it's just stepping back that if you're doing that act, the question is, what does home mean to you? Back to, again, memory and things that we've learned. That I'm not offering you the specifics on that, but I'm just trying to change the way that we look at what that act is of doing and what's really important.
One more.
Hi, thanks for your insightful presentation. So my question relates to the health system, and as we know, it faces financial challenges and competing priorities like staffing shortages. How do you convince your clients to invest more in their capital to ultimately invest in a better health outcome for their staff and patients?
Well, first of all, and I'm pleased that you've raised that, everything I've shown you is for publicly funded organizations. These things aren't costing any more than anybody else is spending. And we, like at home, we have a shopping list. We can't afford everything that's on the list. We have to make priorities on what's important. And so with our clients, we're having discussions about what is important. And back to using the space as an enhancer for something. I mean, an example, this cancer center that we've opened in that country, like our entire healthcare system, as you've mentioned, there's a massive shortage of positions to be filled. And in fact, even the new cancer centers, relatively new ones compared to this one, they are having a very, very hard time to attract and retain staff. There's a lineup for people wanting to come to work here. So is that a good benefit for the client? I think part of it is shifting also a little bit of the discussion that, you know, if you spend $1 on capital cost, how much do you spend on operating costs, mechanical, electrical systems throughout the life of the building? So 1 on capital, how much on operating? $5. What do you spend on the cost of the people in the building in that same period? So you spend $1 on building, 5 on the operating cost. Is it $10? $15? $50? Is it $100? It's $200. So if it's $200, any one of those pennies that you spend on the $1 has massive, massive impact on what the building is created for, which is us to do something. And so when you shift the discussion into that, and clearly there's the evidence in the book that supports it, is that we have to reframe the discussion on why it is what we're doing and what's important from an impact standpoint.
Okay, I think we've run out of time, so I wanted to thank you, Tye. It was, I think it's an inspiring synthesis of research and then, in a sense, demonstration of where that leads in architectural practice. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
And, And thank you all for coming, and don't be strangers to the faculty. We have many events. I hope to see you at them. And Tye has his book outside if you want to either have one or want to buy one, and Tye, you'll sign.
And one thing to mention is if you haven't toured the end of year show that is on all the walls and up in the studio, the work is off the charts.
I wanted to suggest that because they are our future alumni. And I also, bringing it up, I just thank Jeffrey Garcia and Brandon Bergen, who organized and hung the show. The work of the students is great, and the way that they've exhibited makes it really fun to see, very creatively done. So anyway, thank you all for coming, and hope to see you out in the Commons.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you very much. Good to see you. Thanks. Up front, keeping an eye on me.
The question I was going to ask